So our last example here is two functions that we need to graph, two modified sine waves. And remember that the way to do that is to start out with the sine and cosine graphs that you know. So let me start out by graphing sine of x. There's pi, 2 pi, 1, negative 1, pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. And remember, sine of x starts at 0, goes up to 1, comes back to 0, down to negative 1. Oops, that one went down a little too quickly. Down to negative 1 and comes back to 0. So what I graphed there in black is sine x. Now sine of x minus pi over 2, I'll do that in blue. Sine of x minus pi over 2, that takes the graph and it shifts it over to the right by pi over 2 units. So I'm going to take this graph in black and shift it over to the right by pi over 2 units. Let me extend it a little bit so that I'll know how to shift it. Now I'm going to shift it over to the right by pi over 2 units. So now it starts at 0 at pi over 2, comes back to 0 at 3 pi over 2, down to negative 1, back to 0. So what I've drawn there in blue is sine of x minus pi over 2. It's just the basic sine graph, but moved over by pi over 2 units. And we have to figure out if it's odd, even, or neither. Well, remember, odd has rotational symmetry, even has mirror symmetry across the y-axis. And clearly this blue graph that I've drawn here has mirror symmetry across the y-axis, but not rotational symmetry. So this is an even function because it has mirror symmetry across the y-axis. So let's move on to g of x, that's cosine. Again, I'll start with the cosine graph that I've memorized, and hopefully you have too. There's pi, 2 pi, 3 pi over 2, pi over 2, 0, negative pi over 2, 1, and negative 1. That's a little low. Let me draw that a little higher. Negative 1. Remember, the cosine graph starts at 1, goes down to 0, down to negative 1 at pi, and comes back to 0 and back to 1 at 2 pi. So what I graphed there in black was cosine x, the basic cosine curve. Cosine of x plus pi over 2, I'll do this in red. That's the same as, you want to think about that as cosine of x minus negative pi over 2. And I do that to create that negative sign because remember when you have a shift, you always want to have a negative sign there. It helps you figure out which way it's shifting. That means it's shifting negative pi over 2 units to the right, which means pi over 2 units to the left. So I take this graph and I shift it pi over 2 units to the left. So that means it'll start here, go down to 0, down to negative 1, back to 0, up to 1, and back to 0. That was a bit too high there. So that curve in red is cosine of x plus pi over 2. And if we look at that curve, look, it has rotational symmetry around the origin. If you rotated that graph 180 degrees around the origin, it would look the same. It definitely does not have mirror symmetry around the y-axis. So this is an odd function. Odd functions have rotational symmetry around the origin. So that's an odd function. Remember, the way to check whether they're odd or even is to check which kind of symmetry they have, or maybe they don't have either kind of symmetry. So that's the end of our lesson on sines and cosines. This is educator.com.